Hotep, everyone. At the San. Kiambote, one of my favorites. So we greet each other in the languages of our ancestors because we are family. And we are reconnecting the family. It's really an honor to have been chosen as a speaker by the Cipher. I love that name. And to attempt to meet the challenge of this particular subject. I'm glad for the challenge. Let's get started. We're going to look at something that we have great difficulty talking about. Something which has been made into a complex issue, a sensitive issue, a difficult issue. We're going to look at it through a spiritual, cultural, and political lens. It's always a little sensitive talking about sexuality, period. Yet it's extremely important for us to understand it. Our ancestors in classical and traditional African culture had a very sophisticated level of understanding of human sexuality and fashioned a culture which dealt with the issues of healthy human development. And we need to study that. We need to look at that. We need to say, where are we getting our models from? I think that is the question before us tonight. Now, I'm saying that this issue of homosexuality is a complex one. It wasn't always so. Very clear-cut. It was assumed to be obvious in African civilization. It has been made to be complex and challenging through political and economic power. And we need to look at that and we need to talk about it. What I'm going to do finally is to put this issue, the acceptance of it, of homosexuality, the sanctioning of it among Africans, into the context of African sovereignty and see how it fits there and how we look at it, because our objective is African sovereignty. To begin with, the Maafa, we know, represents disconnection from the models of African civilization. It represents disconnection from the mother. It represents disruption. We were stolen. And we became prisoners of war, and we are prisoners of war now. So what does that mean in terms of the behaviors which we have adopted? What does it mean in terms of the woundedness of oppression, which Baba Bukessa and Mama Thea talk about? What does it mean in terms of pathological behavior, of unresolved issues and wounds left unhealed? But in order for us to look at this clearly and understand it clearly, we need to establish the context of Ma'at. That is the African worldview, the balance that is Ma'at. How does sexuality look in the context of Ma'at? Well, let's see. As Africans, we are living and dealing with a spiritual universe. And that's a way of understanding how we relate to reality. The spiritual relationship. We're looking at creation, recreation, creativity, and we're looking at the objective of returning to the womb that is Ma'at. Sexuality becomes a kind of exchange and interchange of energy. And there's a special kind of difference, which is important. The difference between male and female is a critical difference. It's a good difference. In some societies we talk about nyama, and others jia, and others ashe. There would be a term in any African language which represents a kind of current or energy which is biological. And it's like a bioelectricity we could talk about. That's sexuality. And it rests on appositional unity. Appositional unity is complementarity, which is essential in Ma'at. It is essential in the African worldview. So you get the male and female in complement to each other, which is essential for the concept of African life. And so there is balance that comes from that. The balance that is Ma'at, the mother, the womb, the wholeness, and it is manifested on every level. So we can talk about that on the personal level, on the communal level, on the cosmic level. We can talk about that in biological terms, in cultural terms. So therefore, for us as Africans, sexuality is translated into energy capable of becoming force and power. And that force and that power must be directed. It can be destructive. It can dissipate our energies. It can be constructive, contributing to growth and development. Sexual energy can be innervating, that is weakening, or it can be energizing and strengthening. We ought to know how to use it. African culture is about that. And so we have to understand our sexuality in a cosmological context, in the context of African civilization. It's about creating a healthy context for human relationships. That is the function of African culture. That is the function of culture as we know it, is to pattern human energies. Africans together are creating structures, forms, modalities, institutions within which human potential is developed. Again, the African conception of human sexuality and human development is very sophisticated. Emotions, spiritual energy, power to be used to give us a sense of things that we use as intellect. rather than bad. It can lead to the understanding of sexual energy as connection to the universal life force. So we're not saying that sexual energy is a bad thing. We have to understand it in a sacred context. If we know how to use it, then it can work for our health. Knowing how to use it takes work. We got to do our work. It takes study, learning, instruction. And all of this took place traditionally in Africa. So it's like understanding any of the powers that we have been given takes work, takes attention, takes focus. Like the powers of the Orisha, of the Abasu, even of the Insamamfo, the ancestors themselves. We often think that sexuality is just automatic in terms of its meaning and how to use it. It's not true. Because we are erroneously thinking that it is only about pleasure. But then what is pleasure? How is that defined? In what context is it defined? That we're calling pleasure is only part of the significance of sexuality. And should not be the basis on which we make decisions. Again, sexual pleasure should not be the basis on which we make decisions. Just as the pleasure of cocaine should not lead us to use it, for it will use us. The same is with sexual energy. That if pleasure becomes the directing principle, then we're looking at a kind of addiction, where the nerve centers misread signals and become conditioned, become fooled to exhibit inappropriate behavior and to escape from responsibility. Sexual pleasure should not be a form of escape. The African worldview asks all of these questions and answers all of these questions, again, very deep. We're talking about the deep structure of culture. We're talking about deep thought. We're talking about Sodai. And so if we don't address all these levels, we can lose balance. The whole person becomes the objective of the forms that we develop in African culture. Spirit is physical in the African context. And therefore, unhealthy use of sexual energy affects the whole person. It affects the person. It affects personal development. Like, it's important that you choose the people that you're around because of the energy that they give off. Then imagine how vulnerable we become if you engage in sexual activity and the exchange of that energy with the wrong person, with the wrong people. Our spirit is vulnerable. So the African belief is that every person you touch touches you. I'm not talking now about only an act of eroticism. We're talking about much more. The African asili is life-giving. It is a coming together to produce life. So the male and the female principle is the joining of that is how our ancestors come back through our children. I want to repeat that. The joining of male and female is what allows our ancestors to come back to us, which we all are, by the way. We are all ancestors returned. And so, again, to understand this, to use it properly, like anything else in African culture, and that we take seriously, takes time, takes discipline, takes study, and certainly learning. We have to learn that. And that's the context in which we need to be discussing sexuality, which is what we're talking about tonight. And so culturally, this kind of understanding it becomes the foundation of the fabric of our culture. And the fabric of our culture depends on this kind of understanding. Politically, our political clarity helps to define who is friend and who is foe, who is family, who is enemy, who to imitate, who is African, who is non-African. If we are not clear sexually, then we become a threat and a political liability, which is what we're seeing now. One of the reasons that this is so difficult for us to talk about is we're not a people who attack family. And we're talking about family. So we're not here to attack the African family. And all of us, and each of us, has somebody in our family who is living a lifestyle which is dangerous and unhealthy. How do we deal with that? How do we help ourselves and how do we help them? First of all, we need to have clarity. And so, what is happening now is that we're seeing that a form of sexual behavior is becoming ideological. It's becoming an ideology. And so we have difficulty dealing with that because we're talking about family that we don't want to attack. That's not what we're about. Yet at the same time, we're talking about ideological opposition. And we gotta have the courage to look that straight in the face. Let me focus on one aspect of African civilization, and that is African rites of passage. That's become a term that we use far too loosely. But when we study African civilization, you find that this institution is so deep and reflects such a deep level of understanding, again, of human development and human relationship. Let's look at rites of passage at the age of that we consider to be adolescent. Okay? Why is that focused on so much? Why is that so important? Because what's happening at that stage is that we are developing and determining our cultural orientation. We are also determining our bodies are changing. Our bodies are growing, and we are determining our sexual orientation. It's deep. It's not easy. African ritual is not easy. Among the Mende people, there is something called the Humoi Society, Humoi. And that particular secret society, its job is to regulate sexual behavior. It is not considered, that behavior is not considered to be private It's not considered to be, do your own thing. It's considered to be something that affects the entire society. Therefore, we got to pay a lot of attention to it. Responsibility is involved, accountability is involved. To the community, to the ancestors, to the future, to the victory, and to sovereignty. All of that is the responsibility that we have as a people. And so sexual development becomes very important in the African context. And so we have classes. And the elders, specific elders, are assigned to the roles of this instruction in the proper use of our sexuality. So the adolescent rite of passage is a period in which we as Africans are able to address potentially destructive cultural hindrances. They are talked to, they are understood, they are listened to, and they are taught because they are essential and their health is essential to the future of the group. Now, at the same period where there is the focus of this rite of passage, the body itself is going through hormonal changes. Why do our ancestors pick that time, you see, to focus on these kind of deep questions? Young people are being prepared for positions of responsibility. They are being prepared for marriage. And marriage is seen as a political and a spiritual, a cultural responsibility. Marriage between two men, marriage between two women would be considered insanity in the African context of sovereignty. Not even a question, because of what the role of that marriage is, what it's for, the purpose of what it's for. And so, if this is a period of a potential ambivalence among young people, you're not clear. You don't know. You don't know how you're supposed to express what you feel is going on in you. This process of a rite of passage is to give clarity. That's important. We are dealing now in a society in which there is no clarity, and in which that kind of adolescence doesn't get resolved. People don't get clarity, and so you have a society which is being run by adolescents. That's what European culture is. Now, what I want to look at quickly is the nature of the European asili. The asili is the cultural seed. The nature of the European worldview. Let's look and see what happens here, because we're contrasting this. You've got to understand, you all, to begin with, we're different. You know, we ain't European. And so when we imitate what is European, it is out of illness. Okay? Let's look at them. The culture, the worldview represents a repudiation of the Ma'atic order. So for us, that's chaos. And that's Maafa. The asili is anti-life. One author talks about how the Europeans are actually threatened by their children. because they feel that the children might outdo them. So they're in competition with their children. So how do you think they feel about children and having children? Not great. And you got to look at the demographics, you got to look at the numbers, you got to look at the figures. They represent a small percentage of the world's population. And their fertility figures are very, very low. There are some European nations which do not, their index is so low that they don't reproduce themselves. In other words, you've got to be reproducing at a certain number or you're not growing. Okay? They got a lot of that. Now, when we're healthy, Africans, we got the highest fertility rate in the world. Okay? At one point, Kenya had the highest fertility rate. So I'm saying that there's a relationship here between the worldview, okay, and the structure of the culture. They also, their feelings about their ancestors are ambivalent, okay? Is that they want to surpass their ancestors. So they're in competition with what they consider the past, and they're in competition with what they consider to be the future. The ancestors, they want to surpass them. The children, they're afraid that their children are going to outdo them. That's, from an African point of view, that's kind of sick. Okay? Let's look at what else. The worldview is dichotomous. That is, it makes splits. And so you get oppositional pairs. You hear me now? Not complementary. Oppositional pairs. And those pairs become confrontational. Okay? That's important. Very important. No balance. Also materialistic. So there is a denial of spirit, of which they're afraid. There is an alienation from nature and from what is natural. And we could talk about that. We could expand on that. But I'm going to give other people a chance to talk eventually. Their worldview talks about separation and where the everything else becomes objectified, so it's treated as object. That's how they treat us. That's what the Maafa is. The Maafa is the process through which African people become objects for the destruction of European people, of Yururgu. Everything that they do is like that, the self and the other. And this is very important, and I think that Drª saw this. And that is that Yururgu, or the European, is threatened by difference. Now listen to that. Threatened by difference. Remember I started off by saying there's a certain difference that for us is wonderful, right? The difference between male and female, that's essential. And it's essential for life. Europeans have a problem with difference. Okay? Now I want you to be, you should be thinking ahead of me now to see where I'm going with that. Check out the Drª spoke of xenophobia. Xenophobia. That's fear of that which is different. Fear of strangers. Okay? Why? What is that about? And so that is anti-African. Now that xenophobia develops into what we call, Baba Baruti and myself call heterophobia. You with me? Heterophobia. Phobia is a fear, which becomes a hatred, which is a defense thing. Okay? Which is a fear. It's the fear that you gotta watch out. And so then it is also patriarchal. Let's put sexuality into the context of the European asili. First of all, you have sexuality not in a sacred context as it would be in the African understanding, but in a non-spiritual context. So it is individualistic. You have no responsibility for the other person that you are involved with. It is narcissistic. That is this thing about self-pleasure, self-indulgent. That's a big problem for us Africans here in this society, because that's what we get bombarded with on the TV, you know, in the media, in the songs, and all of that. Our children, our young people, as well as us, are getting bombarded by this kind of do-your-own-thing, self-indulgent, narcissistic thing. You know what narcissus? Yeah, it's the one who looked in the mirror and just fell in love with, if they could talk about love, but just became consumed with his own image. And let me take a second here, because it fits right here, and show you how it works when we don't use our own worldview as a reference point. There is, I met a young sister, and she proudly told me, and she was thinking, oh, hey, I'm into African worldview and your work and all of that. So she proudly told me that she was studying, no, she had a card, and on the card it said human sexuality. So I'm like, what is that? You doing that in school? So she said, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing, you know, and she was real proud. And I said, well, what is it? How does it work? What is it about? She said, well, you know, it's the different ways that human beings express their sexuality. I said, like what? She said, well, you know, male and female, and then I said, and you talking about homosexual? She said, yeah, that's one of the ways. And they had a term, I don't even think it was homosexual, but they had a term for that. So I said, well, what else? And she said, well, there's, and I can't remember the term, I should have written down all the terms, but there's one, I said, well, what is that? Where you like everybody. Okay, there's the bi, but then there's also some kind of universal thing where anything and everything, okay? Then there was something she called autosexuality. What is that? That's where you're turned on by yourself. Okay? I said, so you just, y'all do just whatever you can think of, huh? I said, you talk about animals? You know what I'm saying? Human beings turned on by animals. And she said, oh yes, that's such and such and such. I can't tell you what she said, I don't remember the term. She had a term for it. You see what I'm saying? Okay? Which is that we have to look at academia and how it fits into promoting the European worldview and what for us as Africans is illness within that worldview. It legitimizes it and validates it by giving it a term and making it academic. So because she could, you know, run off the names of all of these crazy, bizarre illness things, then it had legitimacy for her, and she didn't even realize that what she was doing was being taken over, being victim. She was being a victim, made a victim of the European worldview and therefore the oppression of what is African in us. Okay, so that's an example. That comes from them. So let's go on. The pleasure principle becomes, that's it. That's the driving force. Promiscuity. Hedonism. Again, that's the pleasure that everything is just, whatever turns you on. We got to understand, you could be conditioned that anything can turn you on, brothers and sisters. That may sound weird to you, but if you are conditioned, all you have to do is to associate a particular form of behavior with pleasure. So the neurotransmitters get, you know, kind of guided in that way or conditioned in that way, and then that's what you do. And while we may not be talking about that, there are all kinds of things that people do, okay? Which may not be healthy for the family, for the culture, the community, and which certainly is not taking us towards sovereignty. So you get sexuality being people are in exploitative relationships. They relate to each other as objects. I got to stop. Oh, okay. It's destructive. It has no communal purpose. It's profane. And can be incestuous. There can be pedophilia. All of this fits within a European worldview. And I'm going to take a second here. Let me just mention prostitution fits. Commercialization fits. Using sexuality to sell products. All of this fits in a European worldview. And what you've got to be thinking is, what happens to the African who takes on the European worldview? What happens to us as a people when we cease to have our own principles, guiding principles, and we are just accepting what we see around us? Okay, these are some of the things that it becomes trivialized, it becomes casual, and I don't know if you realize it, but there's a whole thing about anonymous sex, where that's what turns people off. Where you actually can walk through an area and there's some kind of signals that people have that you go in the bushes and you're with somebody that you don't know and never see again. It may sound bizarre to you. It's common. It's common in the parks. It's common in Central Park. What I want to mention to you, and all of this, there can be an avoidance of mature relationships. Okay? But if we look at Plato, and I suggest you read the Symposium, if you're interested, but it has a whole theory of how human sexuality came to be, where human beings were cut in half, not half this way, but half this way. Sound a little bizarre? And this is Plato now, okay? They're the smartest person. So what happens is that there is always the desire to get back with that other half of you. Not, you know, like if you talk a male, get with a woman. It's a male with a male because you're trying to be whole. That's what Plato says. All right? I was going to read you something. Now this person is talking about, is promoting homosexuality. And so she talks about Plato, and she says that Plato described the love of a young man learning along with philosophy, and that this person is then transported by passionate desire. And he depicts these pairs of lovers as spending their life together in the pursuit of intellectual and what they call spiritual activities, combined with political participation. Now, it says that this kind of activity doesn't prevent them from having a wife at home whom they saw only rarely and for procreative purposes only. I could go on with Aristotle and so forth, but I want to mention that. Mentor, the term mentor that we use as a relationship of an older teacher with a younger person came from the Greek mentor who was a babysitter for, I'm not sure who it was for. Who was it? Yes. When he would go off to war. Well, Bob, if you're going to talk about it, he would go off to war, then he would be like a babysitter. It was a justification of a homosexual relationship between mentor and his young sons. Okay? Now, so I mean, I'm showing you, if you got any doubts about the origins, the foundations of European culture and where these practices come from, we got to look it squarely in the face. Okay? Among the Spartans, everybody knows Sparta? You've got Sparta, you have Athens and all of that, and they're Greeks, and the Spartans were in fact, they got a thing on TV now, right, about the Spartans. I'm going to have to look at that. But they were supposed to be warlike. Well, listen to what they did. They were producing these fighting soldiers. And so what they did was, they would take 5- and 6-year-old boys and, you know, they would begin there, okay? And before that even, there was the practice of infanticide. And infanticide was that you would kill off anybody that you saw with an infirmity at all, that you thought, you know, wasn't really going to be strong and powerful, okay? So then they get these boys that they think have the potential to grow up into warrior soldiers. They then force them into homosexual relationships where the older men would introduce them to those kinds of practices. And the idea was that they would become submissive and live and grow up in an all-male environment, and that this would make them better soldiers. Okay, again, women would only be used to have some more soldiers, some more, okay, men, warriors. And there was a practice at one point of female infanticide. Okay. Now, the man was considered to be perfect, to represent perfection. A woman was a man that was imperfect. Something had happened in the womb to make her not a man, and that was bad. Okay. So, and Plato had the same thing. In fact, you were born as a woman, you were punished. That was a punishment. It was a man coming back as a woman because of a punishment in the last life. So you're getting an idea of the relationship between males and females. So then what you get is, in response to this, you have Sappho, which was that you have an island where all women went, and it was like, okay, y'all doing that, then this is what we're going to do. Okay, and you get the term lesbos, which comes out of that. We need to understand that history. And let me just quickly try to end this up. We are talking about wounds of the Maafa when we put this in the context of our people. We are talking about the loss of sovereignty, of African sovereignty. So what happens then is that our behavior is dictated by the enemy. Okay? Now, why is this, without me going through a whole lot of what I have here, why is it bad and why is it dangerous? I'm coming from the perspective that the practice of homosexuality has become a political ideology. So what we're dealing with is not an individual whose feelings we don't want to hurt. That's not what we're talking about. Because on that level, we got to talk about healing and how do we help in that healing. I'm talking about something on a political level, that homosexuals in this culture are organized, that they represent a power base that normalize that as a practice. So that's what our people are being exposed to, but we're not dealing on a political level. We're dealing like we don't have the right to determine for ourselves what is healthy behavior and to back that up and to support it with a sanctioning force. We don't think we have the right to do that. So what happens? There's confusion. And that's what I call it. It's sexual confusion, and there's all other kinds of confusion because I'm talking, when we look at the wounds of the Maafa, we're not just talking about homosexual behavior. And we've got to be able to look at incest. Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Rape.
That's right.
Child abuse.
That's right.
Within our community. Where does it come from? What do we have to do? How do we address it? We cannot take a wound or a woundedness or an illness and make it into an ideology. What we have to do is to look at the illnesses in our community and in our family and do the personal work that has to be involved in the healing of those things. So we can't be afraid to say, this is illness. Okay? And I'm here to help with whatever kind of investigation we got to do to look at how it's healed. But I'm not going to say that it's not illness. Okay? And then, finally, oh, by the way, let me mention these things quickly, is that I take great offense at people who would promote that lifestyle and choose to be in that lifestyle and then use African culture, use African spirituality to justify it. Because what they do is they're lying about what is ours. So you have people who are doing that. You have articles that are doing that. There was this author, Audre Lorde, who she wrote, and she's the first time that I saw the term homophobic used. You've got to be careful with that. That's like anti-Semitic. It's like, they're going to tell you that your opposition to homosexuality is because you're afraid of being homosexual. Okay? And then we get intimidated by that. We don't want to be called that. It's like somebody, because I'm talking about sovereignty for African people, and they're going to tell me I'm racist. I'm like, if that's your term, then that's what I am. Okay? So that, I don't have time, I'm running out of time, and I don't want to hog this place, but Audre Lorde also talked about woman-to-woman marriage, saying that Africans really believed in homosexuality. There's no such thing as women-to-women marriage, and I can tell you that as an anthropologist, as an African-centered cultural scientist. Now what they're talking about is in Dahomey, where you would have a situation. Dahomey was a patrilineal society, which means that wealth got handed down through the male. that meant that if a woman was a businesswoman and she acquired some wealth and so forth, she couldn't pass it on to anybody. So what she would do was to kind of adopt a younger woman with a husband and her children, like a family, and then pass it down to them. You got that? Herskovits, who was this European anthropologist, said in his description of that, no doubt, these are his words, sometimes this was used as a cover for female homosexuality. He's speculating, and he says sometimes probably, and then what happens is, because it's written down, that gets used, and people now talk about women-to-women marriage. There is nothing that can even be translated as women-to-women marriage. The words are wrong. Okay, so I'm here, I had to say that because I'm here, I'm an advocate of African culture. And I'm going to tell you that throughout African societies, that male-male sexual relationships are looked at as unhealthy and not good for the society. That female-female sexual relationship is looked at as unhealthy for the society, and steps are taken to make sure that it doesn't happen. And with that, I'm going to stop talking.